Hello and welcome to This is the Way, a podcast sponsored by the Hong Kong Ethics Lab of the University of Hong Kong. My name is Richard Kim.
And I'm Justin Tewald. A quick greeting to our Chinese-speaking audience. 欢迎收听道可道中国哲学播客. All right, we are about to present to you a discussion that we've already had with Daniel Bell, who's written a series of dialogues in which contemporary mouthpieces for the classical Chinese thinkers address contemporary issues. And we're going to look at a debate between a classical Confucian philosopher, Xunzi, or rather a modern descendant of him, and a descendant of the classical legalist philosopher, Han Feizi. It's essentially a debate between legalists and Confucians about good governance. And there are lots of ways of characterizing the different sort of political, philosophical approaches between the two schools of thought. But one relatively quick and easy way to do it is to say, well, the legalists believe in strict punishments and rewards, systems of rewards and punishments, and strict rule following, whereas Confucians want something more transformative to happen. They want people to actually change their character so that they're willingly and wholeheartedly engaging in more pro-social behaviors, being kind to people, being respectful, and so on. That's one way of putting it. And I guess Richard and I had a chance to talk about something that I've been curious about for a while, which is, first of all, Richard, do you use these frameworks, the kind of strict punishment and reward framework, legalistic framework, in thinking about parenting or classroom management? And anyway, do you sometimes see yourself as adopting a more legalistic stance or approach when raising your kids or when teaching your students, as opposed to a more Confucian approach that's meant to cultivate enduring traits of character or virtues?
Yeah, that's a great question. So about a month ago, I was teaching Han Fei, the great legalist thinker, and I was reading the text all the time. And yeah, I was wondering, is this going to rub off on me? Am I going to be harsher to my children, when they violate various norms or rules? I must say, I think what often happens are kind of a natural tendencies or dispositional qualities come out. And by nature, I'm like, I have high empathy and I'm just kind of a softie. And it pains me to punish my kids. And I don't like to see them upset. And so I'm just really bad at that. Although I think you do have to make sure rules are enforced. And of course, I'm not a legalist in some of the harsher punishments that we'll be discussing soon enough. But some kind of system of punishments and rewards is necessary for all good parenting, I think. I guess one question that I've wondered about for a long time is, between the rewards and punishments, or the carrot and the stick, is one form better? Is one form more effective? Is one form psychologically healthier? And from what I know, my sense is that modern psychologists do tend to think rewards tend to be a better method. But I've toyed with this thought that maybe it depends on the domain, like the context. What kind of rule breaking are we talking about? Things like that. But I do subscribe to this idea that in order to change your habits, you have to replace that old habit with something that you enjoy or that you find pleasurable, so that you can keep doing it over the long term. It does sound right to me. But of course, if a punishment is hefty enough, right? And if something is so painful, I mean, one of the things you learn when you're a young person is if you overindulge in, let's say, drinking, you will pay the price by having a terrible morning. And so that's a kind of punishment, right? And so it can make you regret what you did and help you to not perform that kind of action anymore. So maybe, I'm not sure. Maybe it is very contextual. And I'm wondering, have you read much on that? What's your thoughts?
I mean, it's funny. I think that's an issue that is at the periphery of our consciousness all the time, but never quite articulated in that way. I always say system of rewards and punishments when I talk about legalist and like-minded approaches to social management or governance. But actually, it's useful to distinguish between systems of rewards and systems of punishment. And now that you mention it, I suppose actually I am almost by default on the side of the view that rewards in some ways have a more transformative or more powerful motivational effect. It's tricky because there is this view, which I think is right, that if you have some sort of punishment and it's very consistently applied so that it's almost a sure thing, that's one of the best ways to assure near full compliance with that rule. There's an Italian theorist of punishment. I forget what his name is actually, but I read him a long time ago. He pointed out that actually there was a tendency in his day, he was a medieval or maybe late medieval, maybe early Enlightenment thinker. So he lived at a time when rulers were attracted to really harsh punishments. And he said, actually, those harsh punishments themselves don't do the trick. It's consistent punishments that matter. So if you are chopping off people's hands for stealing, that seems like it should be effective. But the problem is there's this natural tendency on the part of most human beings to assume that they're different. They somehow can defy the odds, that like most people, yeah, sure, if they steal, their hands are going to get chopped off. But I can evade the law. I can avoid these consequences. And so it's much better to have a kind of light but very consistent punishment so that people know that invariably if they steal, they're going to be fined a certain portion of their income. Then, of course, it'll be a straightforward calculation. They know that it's a sure thing that they'll be fined and they won't do it because it's a net loss for them. With the exception of these very consistent applications of punishment, which are pretty rare, I think, yeah, it's better to motivate people through rewards. Another thing that happens actually is I want to say there's something called the appreciation of the intrinsic goods of an activity, which is a hard thing to capture if it's just through punishments or disincentives alone. So take, for example, imagine learning how to play violin or piano, and imagine that the only reason you're learning to play piano or violin is because if you don't practice every week or every day or what have you, your parent will punish you in various ways. They'll take away your allowance or they'll take away some of your free time. If that's the only motivation, if that's the only incentive to learn how to play those things, I don't know, this is not well informed, but it seems to me psychologically unrealistic that you'll come to love and appreciate the intrinsic joys and pleasures of playing an instrument well.
Right.
Whereas if it's a system of rewards where like the better you get, the more allowance you get or the more free time you are allowed to have or something like that, then it seems more plausible to me actually that you'll eventually come to see it as a really rewarding thing to play violin or piano well.
Yeah. Now that seems right, especially when it comes to more external punishments like being grounded and so on. But I was wondering about like internal punishments too, right? For example, feeling guilty for, letting your friend down or I mean, certain kinds of things that, or like you let yourself down because you decided to go out to party rather than study and then you kind of regret it. So these kinds of also negative feelings, right, are kind of internal punishments and they're definitely not rewards. And so they do seem to have a role in human life, right? Maybe I remember when I was a kid, this is kind of a difficult memory, but like in middle school, I think I went along with a few other kids and making fun of someone. And I remember realizing at some point that really was hurtful to that kid. And then I remember feeling really bad about it. And that feeling bad was a good thing for me. And it did prompt me to reflect on that action. So that's a kind of punishment, right? I mean, or maybe, unless we're just like limiting it to external punishment. So it's pretty complicated, I think.
Yeah, it's nice of you to admit to that, Richard. Yeah, so when I was in middle school, or what we called in my home state junior high, I remember that as a time of really ruthless bullying and picking on people. And I myself picked on other kids and later felt bad about it too, still feel bad about it to this day. I still remember thinking at the time that, feeling bad about it then, but feeling that I had to participate or else I myself would become that object of ridicule and bullying. That it was like one way of establishing that you're at least above being bullied by this particular person, because you participate in the bullying of him. Anyway, yeah, it's a really hard thing to remember. And I also think that guilt and I want to say empathy played a major role in changing my behavior. Martin Hoffman, he's a social psychologist and moral psychologist, really, who writes on empathy, says that we learn these scripts essentially from our parents. And the parents don't have to do that much. They just have to intervene in the lives of their children in a simple way. They say, how would you feel if, and then they fill in the blanks, So like, let's say you make fun of someone's hairstyle or something in front of them, and your parent witnesses, they say, how would you feel if someone made fun of some cosmetic thing about you that you couldn't help, And oftentimes that's enough to get a kid to engage in what they sometimes call perspective taking or role taking and imagine what it's like to be in the shoes of that person. And I almost feel like that does more of the work than guilt. Guilt is more of a consequence of that kind of exercise. Yeah.
Or what about like serious addicts, right? Sometimes what it takes is the so-called rock bottom. And what happens there, from what I've come to understand, is that they get into such a painful mode of existence where they've alienated people that they've loved and their body's in pain. And so oftentimes it is that kind of pain and, I don't know if we want to put it as a kind of punishment that kind of forces them to change because they just don't want to live like that anymore. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, so I guess it can have that kind of effect. Now, I do think that in the long run, I don't think it's the ideal form of motivation for all the reasons you, I think, listed, but it can have some powerful, important effects that can
Yeah.
kind of drive people to make serious modifications of behavior and change their lives in important ways.
Yeah. Well, like I say, I haven't really thought very carefully or systematically about this such that I would be comfortable making generalizations. But my hunch is that if you were to do a kind of quick survey of the research, you would find both some evidence and some desire to believe that negative forms of reinforcement that discourage you from doing bad things because you feel guilt or because of some punishment are in some sense more reliable. They're like more likely to win consistent compliance with whatever particular norm you're trying to promote. And yet somehow don't have the truly transformative effect on someone's psychology that you'd want. You'd want them to come around to the point where they actually don't just do good things to avoid bad consequences, whether those be guilt or punishment, but because they somehow see it as right and even enjoy it in some sense.
Yeah. Yeah. You hope that your neighbor isn't not murdering and stealing from you just because there's a law in place. You would hope that even if the law somehow was discarded the next day, all of a sudden you wouldn't find yourself in fear of getting murdered. And just to be honest, I actually do not think my neighbors would want to murder me as soon as the laws gave out. I think they actually are very good, decent people, and that probably wouldn't even cross their minds at all to do such horrible actions.
Yeah, I'm not so cynical either about your neighbors. And I suppose some of the legalist philosophers that we're going to discuss today would say that's because I'm naive or too influenced by naive Confucianism or something. But yeah, I think that's right. So anyway, all this brings us to our main point, which is about today's topic.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about Han Feizi, and we've already kind of introduced the main core issue that we'll be addressing today, the priority between either virtues and rituals or versus laws. And so today we're going to be joined by Professor Daniel Bell from the University of Hong Kong, where you teach, Justin, and we had a great conversation, really rich inquiries into human psychology, also human nature. And I think this dialogue form really brings alive this conflict, this deep philosophical disagreement between Xunzi and Han Feizi. So I think the listeners will enjoy this conversation quite a bit.
That's right. So every day we have sort of featured thinkers, featured passages. Our featured passages today are going to be from Daniel Bell's book, which is a book of dialogues in which classical Confucian thinkers argue about contemporary problems. The particular chapter we're looking at is one where a modern day Xunzi, that's the great classical philosopher Xunzi, argues about how to best conduct an anti-corruption campaign against public corruption in the political class, with his own student, a modern-day Han Fei, modeled on the legalist philosopher Han Feizi. So the two thinkers we'll be discussing today are essentially a classical Confucian philosopher and quite arguably the greatest legalist philosopher ever to live and write. That's Han Feizi. So the modern avatars of Xunzi and Han Feizi are debating corruption, and your description of their two approaches seems exactly right. I guess I would just add that there's also a sense, oftentimes in secondary scholarship, that Confucians are more idealistic and legalists are more realistic. So legalists assume sort of cynically that you can't just presuppose or assume that people will voluntarily comply with laws and ethical norms, so that you need to set up a system of rewards and punishments, carrots and sticks, as we were saying earlier, in order to force compliance or compel it. Whereas Confucians are at least more idealistic insofar as they want us to hold out some hope for society and government that isn't always forcing compliance or compelling compliance, but is actually just counting on people's general good dispositions and other directed concern and affection and respect for each other as a motivation to treat each other well. The Confucian model, by the way, is often essentially a family. You would imagine a good, well-functioning family. Family members act out of respect and care for each other a lot. They don't just depend upon self-interest and rewards and punishments to get things done. Obviously, sometimes they do, but the larger part of family life is just motivated by love and affection. And Confucians like to make an example of family life and build out from it and say that other sorts of relationships, even more political relationships, in some ways carry some of those distinctive features that we see in family life. So yeah, that's the gist of the two approaches that we're going to look at shortly.
Yep, and we'll continue our conversation, but this time joined by Professor Bell right after this interlude. All right, so we are back, and today we are happy to be joined by Professor Daniel Bell. Professor Bell is one of the leading contemporary political philosophers working on Chinese political thought, Confucianism, and comparative political theory. He's currently chair professor of political theory at the University of Hong Kong. Previously, he was the dean of the School of Political Science and Public Administration at Shandong University and professor at Tsinghua University. He has also been a fellow at Princeton University's Center for Human Values and at Stanford's Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. And many listeners will know him from several influential books, including China's New Confucianism, Beyond Liberal Democracy, The China Model, The Spirit of Cities, and The Dean of Shandong. Actually, my wife is from Shandong, so I've been meaning to read that. And across his body of work, Professor Bell has consistently pushed political philosophy to take non-Western traditions really seriously, such as Confucian political thought, not merely as historical artifacts, but as sources of normative insights for contemporary political problems. And I think one distinctive feature of his work is the way it combines careful philosophical argumentation with institutional and sociological realism. So rather than asking only about what ideal justice would look like, Professor Bell is especially interested in how political ideals can be embodied in concrete society and culture, imperfectly but meaningfully in real political systems, including systems that don't fit neatly into standard liberal democratic categories. And he's also played a major role in shaping our debates and ideas about meritocracy, political legitimacy, leadership, and the ethical evaluation of modern China, and challenging both Western liberal assumptions and simplistic apologetics. We're delighted to have him with us today to talk about a chapter from his forthcoming new book with Princeton University Press, Why Ancient Chinese Political Thought Matters, 4 dialogues on China's past, present, and future, and to explore the deep disagreement between the views of Han Feizi and Xunzi. Professor Daniel Bell, welcome to the podcast.
Well, I'm very happy and honored to join the discussion. I love this podcast.
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, actually, it means a lot to us as well, because I would say that you are among the top 4 or 5 most reliable commentators, by which I mean every time we release an episode, you are among the 4 or 5 people most likely to send us comments, often comments that make me wish I had done something differently or offered a new interpretation, which I think is a sign of constructive commentary, right? The kind that make me regret that I hadn't done it differently. But anyway, it's also meaningful to have you join us, Daniel, because as some listeners may have observed, you teach at the University of Hong Kong. I do as well. So you're a colleague and a neighbor and a friend. So I've sort of relearned the joys of having friends who are neighbors through yours and Pei's decision to move to HKU and to live, it turns out, just 1 floor up from me. So many a night when I thought I was done for the day or I was working and stressed out, you've invited me over for spontaneous get-togethers, usually to drink gin and test my very feeble Jiu Liang. What do we call it? Alcohol tolerance, alcohol drinking ability?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, and, I'm sorry for being a bad influence.
Yeah. I think it's a good influence. I mean, these are kind of social ritual, right? Gin tasting, drinking together. And I will always remember, Daniel, very vividly, that night when we were each in our separate flats, separate apartments, fighting off the effects of typhoon, 2023? And the windows were leaking, water was running everywhere through the air conditioners and so on. We were mopping things up, we were laying out towels. And about 1 a.m., you invited me up for gin. And in the middle of a typhoon, we had gin together. Even for that eerie moment where, I don't know if it was the eye of the storm, but at some moment it became very quiet. We went out on your balcony and observed the storm.
It was the worst of the worst, typhoon number 10, and it felt like it may be one of the last times we were drinking together. Luckily, it didn't prove to be the case.
Yeah, right. So anyway, it's great to have you here. So we're going to discuss your book, and we're going to discuss more specifically one chapter from your book, namely the chapter on Han Feizi and Xunzi, discussing essentially how best to tackle the problem of corruption in public life, especially corruption among political officials. It's set against the background of the relatively recent anti-corruption campaign in mainland China. And anyway, it's just one dialogue among others. So we thought we should start just by asking you about this chapter and a bit about the dialogue form that you've adopted for this particular book.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. Frankly, the book initially was much bigger project. It was meant to be, and I was actually given a contract about 25 years ago by the publisher to write a book in comparative political theory where there would be dialogues in different settings. But it took 25 years to realize it was much too ambitious. But there were these great dialogues in ancient China in the spring and autumn and warring states periods between thinkers who really were engaged with each other in a very serious way. Legalists, Confucians, Taoists, Mohists, I mean, you know all that. And it made sense to put them together in dialogue form in a way that makes the dialogues more accessible. So it's basically a book that tries to introduce these issues, but also to show that they're arguing about perennial issues or timeless issues, like what we're going to discuss today, how to reduce corruption in government, or family law, or just war, or whether the state should fund culture and music. So basically, the creative license was that I took these debates and set them in modern societies and had the descendants of the thinkers argue with each other. Now, it sounds a bit crazy, but it's not really, because as you mentioned, I worked in Shandong province where the party secretary was a descendant of Kongzi. His name was Kong, family name Kong, so of course, which is the same name as Confucius. And he was a 76th generation descendant and firmly attached to the views of his great grandfather, you know. And you have similar people called Hmong, who are descendants of Mencius, who are attached to the views of their ancestors. So it wasn't that crazy to imagine their descendants arguing about the views of their ancestors and how they might apply to contemporary issues. That's the basic idea that animated this book. I'm not sure if it works.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, that's not far-fetched. I think I've had multiple students with a surname that is the same as one of the great philosophers. And yeah, some of them, of course, don't care that much, but some are very proud to be descendants of those philosophers. And I think those of us who are active in the field have all been invited to these little conferences or celebrations of an ancient philosopher, you know, usually on the anniversary of their birth or something, that's often sponsored by, funded by, and hosted by descendants of that philosopher.
Right.
Well, I do want to say a little bit more about the book, just because I think that many of our listeners in particular will find it engaging. We have a lot of listeners who are specialists in Chinese philosophy or philosophy or East Asian studies, but we also have a lot who are just very, very motivated to learn more about Chinese philosophy and are part of the general public. And one of the sort of consistent comments that we get from people who fall in the latter category is that we need to work harder to make the texts more relevant to contemporary issues. That's something that people often ask us to do. How can we position these texts so that the implications for modern life are clearer? And I mean, I think Richard and I try to do that habitually, but it's true that our podcasts tend to be text-focused, focused on the classical texts. So anyway, Daniel's book does exactly that. Just to clarify what the format is, it's basically classical Chinese political thinkers debating present-day issues. Now, that's not quite a sufficiently precise way of putting it, because actually, more specifically, what's going on is it's not the ancient philosophers themselves, but descendants of those philosophers, or we might just say modern spokespeople for those philosophers debate issues of the present day. So it's really a nice excuse to do exactly the sort of thing that some of our regular listeners are always urging us to do. For example, there's another chapter, one that we're not going to discuss today, where a descendant of Confucius, who's now a law professor, I think, at the University of Hong Kong, debates family law on a small island, at a bar, I should say, on a small island, with a kind of bohemian poet styled after the Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi. So his family name is Zhuang. And those are the sorts of debates that Bell sets up in his book. So in the chapter that we'll discuss for today, a present-day Professor Xun debates his own student Han Fei. Well, they're debating how best to rein in corruption in modern China and in general, among the political class in general. So it's essentially a debate between one of the great Confucian philosophers, one of the greatest ever, really, this guy Xunzi, Xunzi, whom we've discussed before. And it's between him and surely the greatest legalist philosopher ever to write, one of the most interesting political philosophers, period, Han Feizi. And that's spelled Hanfeizi. So those of you who follow current events in China may know that the PRC has been undergoing a kind of crackdown on political corruption, an anti-corruption campaign. And generally speaking, I think the approach to this crackdown has been more legalist than Confucian in spirit. I think that's what you sort of presuppose in your explanation or your contextualizing of the debate, Daniel.
Yeah. Maybe let me just add something there. That's true in the sense that the anti-corruption campaign relies a lot on fear, which is a kind of legalist idea. But on the other hand, the legalists also favor transparent rules, and that it's the current anti-corruption campaign doesn't really seem to be open or transparent. Frankly, a lot of public officials just sink into black holes and we don't know what happened to them or why it happened. So in that sense, even the legalists would be critical of the current campaign for not being sufficiently open and transparent about what's going on and why. Yeah.
Yes, right. That's a good point. So strictly speaking, if you're really serious about your legalism, then you have these rules, these institutional rules, laws, policies that are supposed to be transparent. I think of it as having a kind of implicit publicity condition. There has to be some accessibility and intelligibility to the general public for the laws to have their intended effect, for the policies to have their intended effect. Yeah.
Right. Let me take back a little bit what I just said, because it clarifies what you just said. It's for the general public. But when it comes to dealing with public officials, then actually Han Feizi allows for more kind of secret tactics so that they don't really know what's going on. So maybe in that sense, the campaign is faithful to Han Feizi's legalism. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So there's sort of a distinction to be made between the laws or the public rules, which do have to meet some minimum of publicity and transparency, and then these other things that we might call tactics on the part of the governments, which of course can be very opaque to the general public. Yeah.
No, but even the public officials themselves, because they're not supposed to know exactly what's going on, because if the ruler has very clear and transparent rules for dealing with them, then it's easier for the public officials to manipulate the rulers. So sometimes the ruler has to rely on these kind of secret and non-transparent tactics to have better control over the public officials. Yeah.
Right. I was about to note that another way in which it seems like there's some similarity with Han Feizi here is Han Feizi thought the ruler should hide his motives, right? He should be kind of hidden. And so he's not manipulated by the ministers. And I think a lot of people don't really quite understand what Xi Jinping is really desiring all the time, or exactly what's going on. He does seem kind of interestingly hidden. Like he's not as, in the public presence as much, or that's my sense at least. I'm not entirely sure, but I'm not sure if that's how people in China would think of the president, that he's kind of hidden in the background somewhere. And it's not entirely clear what he's up to.
So arguably that's more inspired by this Taoist idea that the way to exercise power is by not being too open about it and by being in the background, and you accumulate mystique that way, so that when you do intervene, people listen, it makes sense. I think Deng Xiaoping was the master of that. I mean, he stayed in the background, and when he had to intervene, like in 1992, he realized the economy was terrible and he needed to go to Shenzhen to say that the market reforms are going to be okay. Then he came out of the background and just made a trip to Shenzhen. Whoop, the whole country veered into a more market-oriented direction. I think that's the sort of thing that maybe amplifies this idea. Yeah.
Yes, that is a Taoist idea, but it's also a Taoist idea that I think the legalists pick up. Sure. Exactly. Shen Dao, you see it in Shen Dao, you see it in Han Feizi, certainly. Han Feizi famously, the text includes 2 extended commentaries on the Tao Te Ching, and they're focused precisely on, among other things, how to cultivate this mystique, in part by making sure that the ruler's actual own intentions and desires are opaque, mysterious to others.
Right. Yeah, and that's one of the things that I think Han Feizi and Xunzi have in common, which is that they took insights from different traditions and different thinkers and made it into more systematic work. I think both thinkers did that.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, so I feel I should say just a little bit more before we plunge in and start reading text. And that's because not all of our listeners know much at all about Han Feizi or about legalism. And we've been sort of speaking as if these are kind of ideological templates that people are familiar with, legalism versus Confucianism, just to make it as intelligible, as intuitive to people as possible. I'd like to expand a little bit before we begin on what it means to say that an approach to governance, say to a particular policy like anti-corruption, is legalist rather than Confucian, if that's right with you guys. So roughly speaking, to say that a policy or a particular political approach or tactic is more legalist than Confucian is to say that it leans heavily on strict rule following, clear and easily implementable procedures and criteria. That's the kind of transparency, the publicity that we talked about earlier. And most importantly, a system of rewards and punishments. I think punishments seem to loom larger in some sense than the rewards. And the system of rewards and punishments is meant to motivate compliance. So what's distinctive about legalism is it's a kind of non-ideal theory about governance where you don't just assume that people will be motivated to comply with the norms that make society well-ordered and harmonious. They need to be motivated through self-interest, essentially through rewards and punishments. So that's a kind of general description of the legalist approach. In contrast with that approach, we can imagine one that doesn't require strict rule following, right? So one that allows people, for example, to make some judgment calls, to use some of their own personal discretion. Moreover, one that doesn't rely solely on self-interest to motivate compliance with norms. So people instead are voluntarily doing nice things for others, engaging in pro-social, other-oriented behavior out of good intentions or compassion or affection or neighborly concern or what have you. Yeah, so that's the more Confucian approach.
Let me just add a little bit. Of course, I agree. But it's also worth noting that the aims are different. For legalists, the aim is to maximize state power, whereas for Confucians, the aim of governance is to benefit the people. That's one difference. Another one is just that the legalist is purely behavioral. They just care about people's behavior. They don't care about what goes inside people's minds, whereas the Confucians really care about moral transformation and motivation. Yeah.
Yes. That really comes up in today's dialogue. So instead of reading original passages of primary text from the Confucian and legalist classics, we're going to read from Daniel's, just little snippets really, from Daniel's debate, the chapter on the anti-corruption campaign. And I think in those passages, it becomes quite clear that one of the things that the modern day spokesperson for Xunzi sees as a major advantage of his more ritual-based method is that it actually changes hearts and minds. It doesn't just change people's behavior. People's character, their desires, their intentions are changed by rituals. So yeah, you're right. That's another important difference. Yeah, so I like to have concrete proposals in view. So just to make it even clearer, we could imagine, say, a legalist versus a Confucian approach to classroom management. I often think about my own classroom management in terms of kind of more legalist versus Confucian approaches. So like, let's say one of the things you want from your students is that they engage in certain kind of protocols which are meant to show respect, like they don't just attack each other, they attack the arguments that they make rather than the person making the arguments. They show appreciation even when there's disagreement and so on. I mean, I think everyone, including a legalist, understands that there's an interest in reducing the temperature after a classroom debate and or in a classroom debate and making sure that everyone is respectful and they don't take the arguments too personally. And so how do you do that? Well, a legalist approach might be something like this. You could just have these rules, always begin your response to another student by thanking them or stating that you appreciate the argument or something like that. Or, always make sure that you refer to the errors of the argument and not the person making the argument. And then the teacher could kind of create a point system which rewards them for observing the rules and deducts points for for failing to follow the rules. And then insert whatever rewards and punishments you might want. Punishments can be things like staying after class or what have you. So that's a kind of legalist approach. In contrast, a more Confucian approach might instruct students to observe certain traditional rules of etiquette and then count on a combination of something like habituation and maybe justification or reason giving to motivate them to practice those rules of etiquette over time. And those rules of etiquette are basically what we mean when we use the word ritual li in the Confucian sense. Rituals are not just ceremonies, but even, sort of social protocols of the kind that we see in good classroom behavior. So the goal then, in that case, would be to get the students fully on board with ritual expressions of mutual respect in the classroom so that it's something they want to do and not just something that they have to do, you see. That really does, I think, get to the heart of some of the major differences between Confucian and legalist approaches to governance.
I think that's a great example, but I wonder if you're a little bit too charitable for the legalists because you mentioned when it comes to dealing with, what common people, so to speak, they rely much more on fear of punishment than on rewards. So I think the punishment aspect would be more clear that if you speak out of line, you get, whipped or whacked or even your finger cut off. I mean, that's much more in line with the legalist spirit of how to govern common people. And whereas the Confucians might not object to things like, a point system for good behavior, and eventually after they internalize it, and then there's no need for a point system. I mean, I think the Confucians would also want to emphasize rituals like after class, you invite the students for a lovely meal with drinking and forge trust between them or engage in sporting activities. And that would be the way of building what we say today as civility. I think those would be also in line with the Confucian spirit, not a purely intellectual approach for dealing with these things.
Yes, good. Yes, so one of the things that happens in the dialogue that we're reading from today is after this debate, which actually ends up being quite, I'm tempted to say that both of the major personalities in this debate, the modern day Xunzi and the modern day Han Feizi, are a little out of line. They start to kind of criticize one another in a rather personal way. But afterwards, they have a banquet, which involves drinking. And then Daniel, through his mouthpieces, through his characters, sort of articulates the rationale for the banquet, one of which is to kind of smooth things over with drink after a lively debate. Boy, people could listen to this episode and get the wrong impression of you, Daniel. Here, I've complimented you for bringing me upstairs to have gin and your praise of drinking at the end of the dialogue.
That's not a wrong impression, but anyway.
Well, up in Shandong, I visited my wife's parents or my parents-in-law, and there's quite a bit of drinking up there in the northern China area with very, very strong, what they call wine, but it's not quite wine as we call that. It's more like a very strong liquor.
Yeah, so Shandong province has the highest per capita alcohol consumption in China. I think it's related to the Confucian ritual aspect. And the liquor you refer to is baijiu. So it's a very strong liquor and usually 53% alcohol.
Yes.
But the drinking is highly ritualized. Like you would never when you're with other people, you never drink alone.
That's right.
And you never lift a glass and drink alone. You always do cheering, not just at the start, but throughout the whole process, which in a way controls the excessive drinking. And even though there is heavy drinking, but it rarely leads to like extreme drunkenness, at least university setting.
Well, I've had mixed experiences there, but I think, I remember one of the protocols was if you want the other person to drink, you do have to drink with them. So that often would help curb some of the excesses because people don't, especially as they get older, they don't really want to drink that much to the point of extreme intoxication. So that would prevent people from, over drinking, I noticed.
Yeah. And some people are allergic to it or they just have a low drinking, ability.
Yes.
And then you could, at least in the university setting, you could have water to mimic the look of this baijiu, of this white liquor, and you could participate in the ritual without actually drinking. So at least in a kind of university setting, it tends to be a more civil form of drinking rituals. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go to our passages. Our focus will be on just 2 passages from Daniel's book. And we're going to keep it focused on the primary issues, which we've determined to be the priority between virtue and ritual versus law. And law here is a translation of the Chinese term fa, which can be translated in many different ways. There's sometimes debates about this, I realize, models, standards, norms. But in the legalist sense, it usually refers to something like public or institutional rules or standards. And so we're really interested in seeing how these 2 philosophers defend their distinctive view about using or prioritizing fa or laws as means of promoting good social behavior. So this first passage, which Daniel will read, will represent Han Feizi's core reasons for prioritizing law over virtue and ritual. And then the second passage will be on Xunzi's core reasons for prioritizing virtue and ritual over law. Okay, so Daniel, would you like to read that first passage?
Okay, thanks, Richard. So this book, almost all of it is translations of the classics, but I have some sentences that are meant to clarify or summarize. So the first sentence is my own, and the rest is the actual words in translation, of course, of Han Feizi. So we need good laws, not good people. Quote now, when a sage governs a state, he does not wait for people to be good in deference to him. Instead, he creates a situation in which people find it impossible to do wrong. If you wait for people to be good in deference to you, you will find that there are no more than 10 good people within the borders of your state. But if you create a situation in which people find it impossible to do wrong, the entire state can be brought into compliance. In governing, one must use what is numerous and abandon what is scarce. Therefore, the sage does not work on his virtue, he works on his laws, end quote.
Yeah, so I think we have lots of thoughts about this, and we'll get to them shortly. Just let me pull out a bit of that quotation, that passage. for closer analysis. So he says, this is a quote from Han Feizi, "If you wait for people to be good in deference to you, you will find that there are no more than 10 good people within the borders of your state. But if you create a situation in which people find it impossible to do wrong, the entire state can be brought into compliance." So it's often said, I think rightly, although we may sort of test this claim a little bit in our discussion, that legalism is more of a realistic political theory or a non-ideal theory, right? And so one of the things that legalists have said historically to recommend their views over and against Confucianism is that they're more realistic than Confucians. Confucians are portrayed as idealists. Xun's is an interesting case. He's probably more realistic than the average Confucian political philosopher. But anyway, so that's the general claim. And here, actually, I think it's useful to pay attention to kinds of non-ideal theory, which basically have to do with what it is that you're idealizing or not idealizing. And so there are many different things that you could potentially idealize if you're an idealist, right? And one of them is compliance with rules or with norms or standards. And so what I think Han Feizi is saying is that he's not going to be an idealist about compliance. He's assuming that you live in a state where many, many people, even if you have really good norms, like ritual rules about how you should treat others and that sort of thing, many people won't voluntarily comply with them. So as he says, you could have no more than 10 good people within the borders of your state. However, if you set it up so that there's these strict incentives, strict rules of punishment, essentially, and maybe some rewards, then you can have perfect compliance because everyone will be brought in, everyone will be incentivized to comply. So that's all. I just want to highlight that there's a strand of non-ideal theory that's really prominent in this particular justification of having good laws and not necessarily good people.
Yeah, I think that's right. The one interesting part about this passage to me is that it suggests that Han Feizi is not completely cynical. I mean, he does allow that there are some virtuous people in the state, which is already, let's say, slightly more idealist than the normal picture of the completely legalist Han Feizi, who just doesn't allow for any virtue at all.
Yeah, right. I mean, actually, I think Richard and I should have more episodes on Han Feizi in the years ahead because Han Feizi is a fascinating thinker. And in fact, he defies stereotypes about him again and again. It's not that he overstates his case, usually. I mean, he's careful to say, yeah, there might actually be a few good people in your state. He's even willing to concede that maybe there were these golden ages, that the Confucians describe, where they once had these really great sage kings. His arguments are meant to sort of build on a kind of tough-minded realism that allows for some nuance, but still says that you have to, in some sense, assume the worst and build up your institutions on the basis of those more cynical or pessimistic assumptions.
And of course, he was writing in the most violent time of the Warring States period, where it makes perhaps more sense to be extremely cynical and rely first and foremost on fear of punishment. And as you say, he allows for a golden past, but he also allows for a golden future where it's unclear how long it would take. For Shangyang, he had a similar view, it would take about 1,000 years, where eventually people internalize the laws and there's no need anymore for the laws to be actually implemented. And then there would be a kind of peaceful and harmonious society without any actual implementation of law and where people are not fearful anymore.
Yeah.
I think that it seems also useful to kind of fill in a little bit of the background here about Han Feizi's view of human nature or human motivation. So he definitely seems to think most people are naturally self-centered. They have very specific kind of material desires that are common, for security, comfort, wealth, and so on. And that cannot really change much. And so it seems like he is building on a certain assumption about how rigidly fixed human motivations are, the content of those motivations. And here it seems like there is kind of a similarity to certain other historical thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, I think. And what's interesting is Hobbes also lived in a really terrible period during the English Civil War, which is very violent. And so you get the sense that maybe both men were kind of looking around and thought, people are fine. Yeah, maybe some people can become like a Kongzi, but that's just extremely rare. And so you got to work with how people tend to be, and how people tend to be are naturally selfish. And it's not that he thinks, therefore we should just give up, but we can work with that and we can work with those selfish tendencies and create the right policies and laws that will actually help us to develop a more stable state. So it seems like, there's this kind of background about human nature and human psychology that is doing quite a bit of work, actually.
I think that's a good point. Also worth noting that he's a kind of materialist in the sense that if we live in a society of material abundance, then there's no need anymore for people to be selfish and compete so much. And whether it's the golden past or the golden future, then it could be relatively peaceful society. In that sense, a parallel would be Karl Marx, where we can have a higher communist society with material abundance, and only then can people be free to, realize their creative talents and so on. But it won't work without this material abundance. Yeah.
And it seems like Marx, Han Fei also, sees human beings as kind of fairly manipulable, or like there's a kind of a social science behind this, that he thinks we can do a lot of work through social engineering, that we can create certain kinds of social structures and motivate people. And so there's a kind of determinism, it seems like, sort of lying in the background that you also find in Marx, a kind of material determinism.
Yeah, and I would just add to this that it's kind of easy to, in the course of describing the self-interested motivations that Han Feizi attributes to people, it's actually possible to idealize those too much, because it turns out he has an even more pessimistic view that people are narrowly self-interested and present-mindedly self-interested. So he has this analogy, he says the work of the ruler is in some sense like lancing the boil on a baby. It's painful at present, but it's best for the baby in the long run if the boil is lanced. He thinks that there's a lot of cases where government intervention is like that, where it actually intervenes on behalf of the people to promote their best interests, but in a longer term sense that they're not motivated by at the present. Yeah.
Right. And the people don't understand, but they will eventually understand in the long term.
Yeah. So just to remind everyone, the context is this anti-corruption campaign and how best to accomplish it. So Han Feizi is offering a general legalist defense, as Daniel has set it up. All this talk about needing good laws and not good people, that is in the context of an argument about how best to tackle public corruption. And so what he's saying essentially is make sure that you have really good laws, which is to say laws that are applied consistently, not just applied to one faction over another or subgroup of people, that are relatively transparent, and that have pretty strong built-in incentives, usually punishment for violating those laws. And so I think actually once you set it up that way, especially as a kind of non-ideal theory, it's easy, at least the first time you hear Han Feizi's arguments, to be sympathetic to them. But in fact, there are a lot of lines of objection historically that have been influential. If it's all right with you, I'll focus on the one that just looms so large for me, which has to do with the quality of life of people who live under these regimes. I mean, once I state it, maybe it's just obvious, but it's just very unpleasant and I think unfulfilling, ungratifying for us. And by us, I just mean normal human beings. If our pro-social behaviors are motivated by self-interest and fear of punishment at every turn, So if that's the only thing that's really motivating me to act in ways that are caring, considerate, and thoughtful, respectful to others, that's just miserable, right? It's miserable for all of us. Professor Xun, I think, this kind of modern-day Xunzi mouthpiece, eventually makes this point in the dialogue by saying something like, essentially, under my student Han Fei's proposed policies, there's no room for virtue to breathe and grow, right? It's just like at every level, you're supposed to be treating people with a kind of suspicion, right? Like even at the level of the family, in family life.
Yeah, because they're the ones, if you're a ruler, who have an interest in taking your position. You have to be especially suspicious of family members.
Yes, exactly right. So, yeah, what happens, as I recall, is that Professor Xun makes this point that it's miserable and it sort of undermines relationships in a way to be regarding everyone with that kind of suspicion. And then Han Fei surprisingly leans into that criticism. He says, yeah, I admit it. It's like miserable. The ruler should be totally suspicious of his family members. He should doubt that they have good reasons to be kind to him and so on. He should, be treating them as if they're all scheming for personal advantage and could betray him at any moment. They see a good opportunity. So, yeah, it's funny that Han Fei's, at least on Daniel's depiction, doesn't really deny the objection. So I'll just say this. I mean, maybe I'm too, naive or sanguine or something about human nature, but I tend to think that it's like a rhetorical and strategic mistake on Han Fei's part to insist that we be so cynical in every single domain of life, right? That is, I think it's actually true that family members in general, not all, but in many normal families, they can, at least in some respects, be counted on to act out of love rather than self-interest, act out of love for each other, right? Rather than out of self-interest. So I don't think that relationships really can be built entirely on this sort of really shaky foundation of mutual suspicion and mutual interest. And I just don't think those relationships are meaningful or gratifying in any case. So I think that Han Feizi, this is all just to say, Han Feizi would have been much better off if he had been a little bit more clear about which spheres he meant to apply his general rules, his legalistic methods to. So if he wanted a more defensible view, he would have said something like, well, in the public sphere, we should generally assume that most people will not be compliant with good social norms. And therefore, in some sense, in the public life, exchanges, interactions in public squares, commercial interactions, and so on, you should have strict rule following with rewards and punishments to incentivize compliance. But not in every sphere, not in family life, maybe not even among close neighbors, good friends, that kind of thing. I just think that would have been a better move on his part.
I think that's right, but it would go against his view that the whole aim of politics is to maximize state power. So whatever is necessary to increase the power of the state should be done. And if it means intervening in family relations so that individuals are made to serve the state rather than their loved ones, then that's what you have to do. And it's not just a purely theoretical view, right? I mean, it meant radical intervention in family ties. And it's not coincidence that legalism was like dead as a reigning ideology for about 2,000 years, but it's revived in the Cultural Revolution when family members were forced to denounce each other if they were perceived to be counter-revolution. That is in line with this idea that the whole aim of politics is to maximize state power. So only if you remove that governing assumption, then maybe would he allow for different spheres where you could have love and virtue and care. I mean, that's one point. Another point, maybe more controversial, is that he just seems to be a sociopath. I mean, he doesn't believe that people can have empathy or compassion for others, which just seems completely, sociopathic. I mean, there's no other way to describe it, right? I mean, Shangyang arguably is even worse. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, so Daniel mentions another legalist philosopher, an earlier one, Shangyang or Lord Shang. And if you read his work, you'll see he's even kind of more brutal and maybe more sociopathic. Yeah. Han Feizi allows that at least some people might be decent. It's just that we shouldn't build a state and state institutions around those people.
Right.
You do wonder if he himself was some kind of sociopath in the sense that he didn't experience the intensity of these affections or intimate feelings or love. Did he just not have those kinds of experiences as a human being, toward his own parents or toward his friends or people he was close to? Because it does seem like he has a kind of impoverished view of human psychology. He's missing various types of motivations. And he thinks that there's just this kind of narrow set of motivations that everyone's basically rigidly fixed by. And he doesn't seem to think these are very strong things, to the point where he thinks, yeah, we can just kind of control people by using these incentives and playing on their narrow self-interest. But for a lot of people, they would go to great length not to give up their parents or their friends and people they have strong attachment to. And it seems like Han Feizi downplays the strength of those kinds of motivations. And you wonder if it's because he himself didn't experience that. I mean, I guess if you yourself don't really have much of those kinds of feelings or motivations, then maybe you also kind of extrapolate naturally and to think, oh, well, no, those are overweight or people aren't motivated as strongly as people think in that form.
Yeah, I agree. It's worth asking why he had such an impoverished view of human nature. And maybe he was just a sociopath, just genetically, I don't know if that's the right way of saying it, incapable of compassion, empathy. But also he had apparently a lisp, right? So he wasn't a very good speaker, which is, for us, the good part is that he wrote his words on paper and we have it now. But maybe he had some sort of physical deformity and he was treated horribly by others. And that may also help to explain the outlook.
Yeah.
If I can go on more pop psychoanalysis. Yeah.
Yeah,
he had a bad stutter, right? That's usually
stutter,
the account.
exactly.
Yeah.
Right. It's interesting to speculate about that. That's right. So there's some discussion of his speech impediments. And by the way, I do want to underscore something that Daniel just said. He is a great writer. I mean, it's actually really a joy to read Han Feizi. In my early days of studying classical Chinese, I tried to commit whole passages to memory just because they were so beautiful and just so elegant. So yeah, it's interesting to speculate about that. But I'll say we don't even have to go that far. I mean, there are plenty of people who themselves actually live by implicit rules and according to implicit norms that they haven't fully articulated in their own minds. I mean, we were just talking about this not long ago, Richard, when we talked about Peter Singer and how he sort of fell short of his own utilitarian, his sort of ruthless utilitarian principles, insofar as he spent extravagantly to take care of his mother in her old age. That's just one of those cases where it's like, I think Peter Singer himself actually was quite humane, and quite loving and caring. It's just that he hadn't quite theorized those insights, or he hadn't quite become sort of self-aware in a way that allowed him to appropriate these insights into his theory. And so that's another possibility, is that Han Feizi was just sort of under the spell of this very cynical, very non-ideal or realistic kind of account of human nature, and just couldn't see his way out of it, even though, in fact, maybe in his day-to-day interactions, he was a decent person,
But there's no evidence that he was humane and caring as a person, right? So that's quite a charitable interpretation, Justin.
Yeah, right.
Well, I was wondering if maybe he thought things are so bad that maybe anything is better than this. Maybe that's the way that Thomas Hobbes would have put it. We need to submit to the Leviathan or sovereign power because the state that we're in is just unbearable. And so maybe the ideal would be this wonderful, warm, interpersonal trust and friendships. But, no, we got to get out of this kind of hellhole that we're in this warring states period.
Okay, but Hobbes still, the point ultimately the point of state is to benefit humans, right? The most fundamental need is our right to life, our right not to be subject to violent death at the hands of others. And you organize a state, and the point is still to benefit humans. But for Han Fei, it's not. The point is to maximize state power. It's such a weird view. And everybody's miserable. I mean, the people live in fear of punishment. The bureaucrats live in fear of, they can never make progress because all they're supposed to do is their assigned role, and they live in fear of making mistakes. And then even the ruler can't express his desires because otherwise he might be manipulated by the bureaucrats. It's like a state where everybody's miserable. It's a very strange idea.
There's no interpretation in which one could argue for Han Feizi here and say, but if pushed and ask, well, why is state power so important? He wouldn't be able to make that next step and say, well, because then we would have a stable society in which people can do better or lead better lives. He wouldn't just go to that next small step.
He does suggest that, again, Shangyang is similar in this way, where, as mentioned earlier, that the long-term aim is to move towards a state where people just internalize the laws and they don't live in fear of punishment anymore. So that's very charitable, but there's no mechanism for how we could transition from this kind of totalitarian order where everybody is miserable to this more peaceful and harmonious order. So it seems highly, and even the end state doesn't include things that we would all care about, like a vibrant intellectual life, cultural diversity, respect for people, humaneness. I mean, that's absent even from the long-term view.
Yeah, right. So I really appreciate Richard's attempt to, I don't know if the word soft pedal is right, but anyway, to kind of soften Han Feizi and give us a more plausible, maybe charitable reading of him. And there, by the way, among scholars of Han Feizi, there are people who do that. So over and against Daniel's claim, which I think is probably right, but Han Feizi is all about sort of maximizing state power, even if that comes at some sacrifice in terms of quality of life or family life. There are some people who say, no, it's actually ultimately about bringing a kind of public good, which is security and order, which was direly lacking in warring states China. And so he's thinking, well, at least if I can't provide people with a kind of flourishing life with happy families and so on, I can provide them with stability and safety and security. And so then on that more charitable reading, you could add, as Richard was trying to suggest, that once you've established a sort of minimum of safety, security, and stability, then perhaps you could go on to seek for these higher goods. But then Daniel's response is, really isn't a mechanism for that. You don't see much in the way of kind of institution building or even a theory to account for how you do that.
And there's no evidence that he cares about these higher goods. Remember, he calls intellectuals vermin who should be exterminated, including the teacher, Xunzi.
Yeah, right, yeah.
It's really hard to be charitable. Although that said, Justin, we have a colleague at Hong Kong U, Olivia Milburn, who's doing a complete translation of Han Fei. It's actually very sympathetic to his views. So if you want a different, more charitable view of Han Fei, she's probably would be a good person for this podcast. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, I talk to her often. She has so many translation projects in the works. I didn't know that she was still working on that. That's great. Yeah. Yeah. And then there are those people who say, including Tao Jiang actually has said this, that legalism gives us a kind of nice conceptual framework for understanding constitutional checks and balances and that kind of thing. So there are ways that we could still use legalism more constructively, even if we think that Han Fei's views taken as a whole package are problematic.
I think that's right, but Xunzi does the same work. The state should be more impartial and have bureaucracy that's more meritocratic. I mean, I think we can derive most of the good stuff from Xunzi, but anyway, that's my bias. In my book, I try to be charitable to both sides for the
Yeah, right. Yeah, I said that Daniel sends me feedback on the episodes quite often. I can always predict with about 90% success that the feedback will be an attempt to read the Confucians' view more charitably, and maybe a suggestion that I was reading the Taoist or other Moist thinker too charitably.
I apologize. My book, again, tries to be charitable to all schools. Anyway.
Yeah. So, right, but you make an interesting point. So you might say, and many people have said, okay, we can't buy the whole package of Han Feizi. Han Feizi is just too brutal. There's no room for a life that we consider to be a good one in any kind of meaningful or robust sense in Han Feizi's worldview. But we could still, nevertheless, take some parts and abandon others. And the parts that we'll take have to do with the minimum conditions necessary to establish security and stability. And then we can go on to adopt other views, maybe Confucian views or Taoist views or what have you, to help realize other goods. That's one temptation. But then Daniel's point, just to underscore something, is actually, if that's what you want, Xunzi, this other Confucian philosopher, already does that quite well. So Xunzi is, as I mentioned earlier, known as more of a realist, more of a non-ideal theorist than other Confucian philosophers. That's in part because he took the time to sort of distinguish between gradations of ideal and non-ideal rule. And he had a whole series of kind of different levels of hegemon or ba. These are people who are sort of not quite as virtuous as a true king, less virtuous, but still able to bring certain important social goods to their states, to the classical China. And so that's one way among many others. He also makes more allowances for law and rewards and punishments, in which Xunzi is more of a non-ideal theorist.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah. So we're talking about Xunzi. And of course, our second passage is on Xunzi's core arguments for the primacy of virtue and ritual over law. And so I think, it'd be a good time to get to that passage. And Justin, I believe that you are going to represent Xunzi here and read for us.
Yeah. So I'm going to read Xunzi. That's the nicer part to read, by the way. Thanks for letting me read Xunzi's part. Let me set it up a little bit, because I think it is an attempt to defend this idea that virtue and ritual should in various senses get priority over law in good governance. But it actually comes in the context of an interesting digression in the debate, which has to do with mourning rituals. Rituals having to do with mourning the dead, right? The people who are recently deceased, or in some cases not so recently. And Xunzi, if you read him, he is a great ritual theorist, a very interesting ritual theorist, but he focuses on mourning rituals, rituals meant to help us cope with our grief and so on, more than any other. So Daniel decided to kind of, in some sense, transplant that obsession with mourning rituals into the dialogue. So that at one point, Han Fei, his sparring partner, is complaining that it seems like Xunzi thinks you just have to force people to treat the corpses of the dead well, and that somehow is going to solve all problems. And so anyway, at one point, the chair, there is a kind of person, a moderator of this debate, who intervenes and says, okay, Xunzi, you've been talking a lot about mourning rituals. Let me just give you a chance to explain, what does this have to do with combating corruption? Why mourning rituals? Why are they so important for this problem of public corruption? How will they be effective in undermining corruption? This is Professor Xun, the modern day Xunzi. If we care about long-term effectiveness, the only way to combat corruption is to make people more public-spirited and sensitive to the suffering of others. If our government officials are more public-spirited, they will be more willing to serve the public and less likely to misuse public resources for their own selfish purposes. How to change the motivation of public officials so that they care more about public interest? Again, the best mechanism is to change them via social rituals that have proven to be effective for that purpose. That's why I emphasize rituals involving proper treatment of the dead. The dead, for obvious reasons, are the least capable of protecting their interests. They are quite literally the worst off of the worst off. Hence, those with power, the living, need to be trained by means of certain rituals to treat them with love and respect. Okay, so let me pause in my reading for a bit. Xun has given us his justification for using rituals rather than legalistic means. So that's what he's been doing. And now he's going to turn to describing proper mourning rituals, proper funerals and rituals for grieving the dead specifically. And in this part, there will be more quoting of the original Xunzi. All right, so I'll continue. It is important to adorn the corpse because, quote, if the corpse is not adorned, it becomes hideous. And if it is hideous, no grief will be felt, end quote. The corpse must be gradually moved away each time it is adorned because, quote, if it is kept close at hand, one begins to scorn it. When having it close at hand makes it the object of scorn, one begins to weary of it. When one wearies of it, one forgets one's duty to it. And if one forgets one's duties, then one no longer shows proper respect, end quote. The ritual should be gradually phased out so that it allows for a smooth transition to everyday life, quote, whereby he cares for the needs of the living, end quote. The moral effect is clear. If the ritual is done properly, it cultivates an altruistic outlook. The living care for the dead, and the dead cannot reciprocate. It's a pure form of caring for others. When altruism can be extended to those who need to care in the world of the living, we can be sure that public officials who undergo such rituals will care for the people and not be corrupt. Okay, so that is the whole passage in which Xunzi defends his seeming obsession with mourning rituals as an important antidote to the problem of public corruption, and his sort of obsession with mourning rituals as a kind of paradigm case, an object of study in terms of figuring out what the purpose of the rituals are in general. So just to kind of pull out a few things for highlighting, it comes at a point in the debate in which Professor Xun has established that mere rewards and punishments are too thin, too superficial, too transitory a basis for changing people's behavior. And so if people are only behaving in kind of pro-social and orderly ways because they're afraid of punishment, well, they'll be lazy about it. They'll fulfill the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law, right? They'll revert to their worst behavior the minute the authorities' backs are turned, so to speak. So that's just all problematic. Professor Xun has highlighted all these criticisms of Han Fei's approach. And so now he's saying, well, what I'm looking for is something that's more long-lasting, that has a more permanent effect on people. And then he makes this really interesting point about mourning rituals in general, which is that the dead are helpless. I mean, here is one case where you're doing something for someone, right? A deceased person, where they can't reciprocate. They have no power over you, right? So it really is a kind of act of unvarnished, unqualified altruism, except perhaps insofar as maybe you're doing it to make a display of your filial piety or your grief or whatever for others. But still, in life in general, there are not many opportunities to do so much for someone where you know for sure that there will be no chance for them to reciprocate. And this is one of them. And so the mourning rituals are fundamental in that sense.
Yeah, I really like this highlighting of this mourning ritual for exactly those reasons you just mentioned, Justin, which is there's a kind of a non-instrumentalist view here about what values matter. So like we have a good reason to respect the dead and honor them, not because then we get something, but because there's a kind of form to ethical thought or something like that. There's this old story told by Philippa Foot in her book, Natural Goodness, where she talks about this photographer who promised never to photograph the indigenous people. And as the photographer is about to leave, he sees someone sleeping, and he has this thought that, well, if I took the photograph, like, no, none of them would ever know, and maybe there'll be a benefit to society. But he chooses not to because he wants to honor that promise. And so if you just have a purely kind of a consequentialist mindset, an instrumentalizing mindset, you might just go, oh, but there's greater benefits for breaking the promise. But then there's a kind of form to ethical thought, I think, here. Things like reasons not to break promises, or to honor the dead, or to recognize the dignity of an individual life. Things like that, where it seems like there's something fundamental to our moral beliefs here. And it seems like Professor Xun here, Xunzi, thinks that that's a kind of foundation to ethical life that we need to sort of get right. And then, of course, punishments and rewards maybe have their place. But if we don't have that fundamental foundation, then things will gradually erode. Because, first of all, I mean, there'll be times when we might not be able to get caught, and then we'll just be incentivized to break the rule or whatever. Also, It just seems to erode like a basic part of human life, which is to respect the dead or respect others, and these kinds of non-instrumentalist obligations that we have that we should keep anyways. I found this to be extremely interesting.
I like that way of putting it, but I worry a little bit it's too intellectual. It's not so much about changing beliefs, it's about changing the heart and making people care about others because it's not natural, right? I mean, that's Xunzi's view that we have a tendency to at least to selfishness, but we can change through these rituals. And it happens unintentionally in the case of most people. It's not like you have new beliefs. It's just that through participating in these very emotionally intense rituals on a regular basis and with people that you love, like your dead relatives, eventually you would just almost naturally extend that love to the people outside of the ritual itself. I mean, that's the basic idea. But like you said, it's not just the heart. You need laws in the background. He's not a pure idealist. Like Han Fei is saying, it's only about laws. Xun says, no, the laws should be there in the background. But then you also have to transform people's hearts. And how do you do that? It's through these very emotionally intense rituals practiced on a regular basis. And also, it's not something that we discussed here, but they usually accompanied by music, by beautiful music, because that too engages with the emotions, right? So in Chinese, we say 礼乐, that's so common, right? Ritual and music. And this ideal society has both rituals and music, because then they could transform the hearts. And that's I think the really key insight here for Xunzi. Yeah.
Yeah. I really like Richard's point, though. And I think maybe we can just add a footnote or something and say he is intellectualizing it, but he's talking about the rationale of the heart and not the rationale of the mind, right? Of the intellect.
If I could jump on that a little bit, and I agree with it. So what really distinguishes, I don't know, the good public officials as opposed to the common people is that the public officials, they understand the theory of rituals. They understand that this is the role of rituals. And actually, one important standard for being selected as a public official is that you can theorize the role of rituals. You can understand how they work. And that's very interesting to me. But for common people, then they're not expected to understand. So he does have this view, which today maybe we might view as a little bit elitist, but that's his view.
Yeah, that's true. So one thing that's interesting about Xunzi that I think Richard and I will discuss someday is that he has, in some sense, when it comes to justifying the rituals, he has a very classist approach. He thinks that there's the kind of justification that will be acceptable to ordinary people. And then there's the kind of justification that the educated classes that are involved in actually running government and being leaders of communities do. And yeah, he's happy to leave the superstition to the hoi polloi, ordinary people. But right. He thinks that the people who belong to this more educated class of scholar official should know better.
But to be fair to Xunzi, he does allow for upward and downward mobility. He's very clear about that, right?
Yeah.
Public officials who perform well should be promoted independent of their class background, and those who do not perform well should be demoted. So it's really a political meritocracy in the sense that everybody should have equal opportunity to start, but then we need to select and promote those who are good and demote those who are not. So it's not classist in a sense that there's kind of fixed aristocratic, blood, educated classes that are different from the rest. That's not his view, right?
Yeah.
One place where I would push back against Xunzi here, though, is so on his view, we're born morally blind, and these are kind of ethical ideas that needs to be sort of pushed into us from the outside. But this idea that we should respect the dead, that we shouldn't just discard them like a broken teapot, that seems much more of a natural kind of thought that I think we do find across cultures and societies. Now, how that gets actualized will vary across cultures, but that thought that we shouldn't just discard these people that we loved after they died in any old manner, that seems such a natural part of our thinking and moral beliefs and judgment. I think that's one reason why Xunzi's view here has so much purchase. That's why the ritual can really sort of get submerged into our moral consciousness and play such a serious role in our life. I don't think it's just this kind of, it could have just been any other method that we could have adopted. I guess here, I think the mentioned view has more plausibility where there are certain patterns or certain ways of thinking about how we should act and what it is to act well that does seem to be more in harmony with some, it's hard to, describe this, but some kind of natural form of our ethical thinking. Anyways, I think that's, of course, kind of controversial and difficult point, but yeah.
Could I just add a little bit of context for some of our listeners? So what Richard is talking about here is the fact that Xunzi is not only known as this great ritual theorist and as a proponent of ritual, but he's also famous for arguing that human nature is bad. You can understand that claim, human nature is bad, in many different ways, or human nature is evil, maybe. But one of the things that motivates that claim, essentially, is that he thinks the work of becoming a good person is mostly artificial work. And the work that he has in mind, primarily, are setting up standards of right action that he calls E, and especially rituals. So he thinks rituals are very artificial things. And as I understand you, Richard, you're taking the line that seems more characteristic of Mengzi or Mencius and saying that no, even rituals in some sense could be understood as extensions of natural feelings or natural outgrowths.
They're anchored in something that's more of a natural sentiment, and which is why they don't seem as alien and why they have purchase on us. If it was something like, oh, you should just like torture, or just really, I just remember, the loved ones that just passed away and just kind of throw them into a trash can. I don't think that would have purchase because of the way that we conceptualize the meaningfulness of the relationships, the kind of the sort of attitude we should have for the dead, which is to kind of honor them, and that there's a kind of sacredness to it. I think we find that across cultures and societies.
I agree with that. It's a beautiful thought, and I actually agree with it. Just two tiny points. I mean, for Xunzi, I'm not sure about the translation human nature is bad, like xing. I would translate as a tendency to badness because it can be changed, right? And the second point is that compared to like Mengzi or Mencius, the worst part, the most violent part of the Warring States period, when there were massacres of, you can imagine hundreds of thousands of people killed in battles. And you can imagine there it would be harder to develop the view that there's a natural feeling for the dead. Maybe that might be a difference. But I agree with you that in kind of contexts that are less violent, and then it does seem to be a cross-cultural feature as far as I know.
Yeah. I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk more about that question, which is essentially a deep one that goes right to the heart of the debate between Xunzi and Mencius. I'm wondering if we should pull it all together and speculate a little bit about how this debate turns out in terms of it, who ends up winning maybe, or who ends up making the better case, Han Feizi or Xunzi. So if it's all right with you, Daniel, I believe in philosophy that there are no spoilers. I think in philosophy, the following the argument is hard enough that in general, it's good for people to know the conclusion.
Okay.
So I'll say that in my view, and admittedly, this is my reading, it may not be meant this way, other people may read it differently. Professor Xun comes out ahead of his student. He ends up making the better case. It's in part just because it seems to me that his arguments are stronger. It's in part because the chair, the person who's moderating the debate, seems to be more convinced of Professor Xun's views. Yeah, so then the question is, where does that leave us? Do we just agree with Xunzi, or do we think that he's right about how to tackle the problem of public corruption? And I think that even though Xunzi may win the debate, many people may still have legitimate questions about whether Xunzi's methods are going to succeed, especially given his obsession with morning rituals in particular.
Sure. So on the one hand, I agree with you. On the other hand, we have a friend, Bai Tongdong, who's more sympathetic to legalism these days, and he actually thought he was much more sympathetic with Han Feizi in this debate. Anyway, so it depends on our own predispositions, right? I think both of us are generally more sympathetic to the Confucian line. But the Xunzi view, again, it's not that rituals are sufficient, right? You need laws in the background, and then rituals accompanied by beautiful music, but also, remember, accompanied by education, right? And good teachers or good models. So you need different mechanisms that allow, let's put it this way, the good side of human nature to flourish. And the idea that you could combat corruption just by relying on harsh laws and fear of punishment, or by kind of the rulers' tricks that manipulate public officials, that just, maybe it works in the long term. It's in the short term, but can it work in the long term? This is where Xunzi, he predicted, right? This is before China had been unified by Qin Shi Huangdi. He says, look, the Qin is the most powerful state now. They can use these techniques, but after 3 or 4 generations, it's not going to work, because as soon as people get a chance to disobey, they will. And nobody likes to live under these very cruel regimes for a long time. And he was right historically. So I don't think there's any historical evidence to support this Han Feizi view that virtue plays no role at all in governing a state or reducing corruption.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so to fill listeners in on a bit of the history, in a way, Han Feizi won the immediate battle, intellectual battle, but then lost the war. That's one way of interpreting history. So by the end of the Warring States, it came to a close because this one of the Warring States, Qing, eventually conquered all the others. And it was quite successful at conquering the others, in part because it used these kind of ruthless legalist tactics. So legalism was in some sense the official state ideology of this empire that we now call China. It was the Qing dynasty. But the Qing dynasty, which was the one legalist dynasty, one overtly or explicitly legalist dynasty, was very short-lived. And it could be that the reason why it was short-lived points to the very shortcomings of this kind of ruthless way of thinking about governance. So arguably, the revolt that eventually overthrew the Qing was started by a captain of a military unit who his unit was delayed by rain and mud and had been assigned a task of marching to one particular destination. And they were so late that they were essentially supposed to be executed for arriving late. And they thought, well, if that's the case, there's no reason not to rebel, right? And so if that's the kind of regime that people are living under, where the punishments are so harsh, you would just expect that people would find them intolerable, and they would make the kind of rational calculation now and then that it's not in their interest to obey the regime. So you might say that that exposes one of the weaknesses of Han Fei's method.
Yeah, I was wondering maybe we should try to defend Han Fei a little bit. I mean, we didn't quite, of course, we don't have the time to really think through all of his different ideas, but some of the ideas, I think, like, they play an important role even in contemporary political philosophy. So like this idea of separating the role from virtue. So like we do want to be able to create a system in which we don't have to rely on really good, like virtuous people to be able to have the system continuing on. I think that was part of some of the ideas at least found in the Constitution, where we don't have to rely on individual brilliance. We want to be able to decouple those things. And so I think that's actually a really important idea. And which is connected to his ideas about bureaucracy and necessarily detaching the personal from the system itself. So I think those ideas are actually still very important.
That's a good point, Richard. Yeah. So actually, both Shen Dao and Han Feizi explain this idea very well. There's a sense in which you want government to be institutions that have some lasting power independently of the people who run them. In order to do that, you need rules and procedures which guarantee that even when you lose people of good character and replace them with mediocre people, they'll still continue running relatively well. And you accomplish that by setting up a system where everyone's sort of motivated to comply with the rules, whether they're using good judgment or not, essentially,
That's right. And to support that too, for Han Fei, the charitable point is too, as well, is that it would work even with a mediocre ruler, right? You have a machine in place that runs according to impersonal bureaucratic rules, and the ruler rarely interferes. And I don't think it's a kind of crazy interpretation. The part of the point is that he wants to implement a political system that works even with mediocre rulers.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there's a dimension to this debate which comes out a bit in Daniel's dialogue, but that we haven't really touched upon, which has to do with assuming that you have relatively good state machinery, which is to say relatively good systems of rewards and punishment for the ordinary people. Well, how do you get that set up in the first place? And how do you guarantee that it's enforced well? Presumably, you have to have public officials setting up that machinery and enforcing it, right? And Xunzi likes to press the point, well, you need those public officials to be relatively good people, or else they're going to manipulate the machinery of state to serve them, right? And so it seems like Xunzi has a sort of winning point there, which is that, well, at the very least, the kind of political elite need to have good character and have to have virtues and other directed care and concern. But actually, Han Feizi does have a response to that objection, which is he thinks the machinery of state can go all the way up to the highest levels, to the ruler himself, so that even the ruler is incentivized to be relatively compliant, to obey the rules, to appoint reasonably good or competent people to various positions so that the state runs well. Yeah, so I guess I just want to point out that there's a sort of debate about how it is exactly that you incentivize people at the highest levels of political authority to be good at governance. Yeah, and that's a tough one. I have to say, Xunzi at the end of the day, I think is right that it's hard to imagine rules that are so well defined, so fine-grained, right, and so precise as to be able to do all the work that you want them to do at those higher levels. So it seems like you just can't avoid but the problem of needing someone with relatively good judgment calling the shots at the highest levels, and that person of good judgment better have good character.
Well, Han Feizi there might say he doesn't necessarily need virtue. He just needs a good epistemic judgment, or like a good understanding of conditional statements of how people behave given certain conditions. And so, yeah, you need a ruler who's not dumb, maybe. Yeah, so maybe it can't just be pure mediocrity, especially to get it going. But you don't necessarily need like a sage-like character. Maybe Han would say something like that. And
Yeah.
I agree. But the point is that we want sage-like characters. Somebody who's at least partly committed to serving other people as opposed to their own or family interests. That's all that's necessary. And I don't think it's necessary to have a sage-like character. And even Xunzi doesn't have such a demanding kind of standard.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point, though. to put it in terms that would be more familiar to kind of historical debates over the course of more than 2,000 years of Chinese political thought after this classical period, there was this kind of emphasis, for example, on what's in Chinese is called xian, classical Chinese, understood as like worthiness or good character or virtue, versus cai, talent, which at least in the context of some political theorists, some thinkers that wrote, cai is something that can be divorced from the moral content of virtue. So what Richard is suggesting is maybe Han Fei is looking for a system where you have people at the very top who have a lot of cai, talent, but don't have virtue. Maybe there's a way of setting up the rules. So
I think that's right. I mean, another thinker who's sympathetic to legalism is Yuri Pine, and he thinks that's exactly it, that the kind of political meritocracy that legalist favors strictly about nung or cai. It's about having good knowledge and political judgment, but no concern about this xian, about virtue. And they think the Confucians are all hypocrites, and I mean, that's a view that I think we do have contemporary thinkers, including Yuri Pines, who are quite sympathetic to that view.
Yeah, it's a tough one, though. There's a number of issues I want to entangle there that I think would take us too far afield. Could I just say one more thing as a kind of closing thought? I'm sure you have your own closing thoughts, and if this is just too much, we can cut it out later. I just want to say it's a commonplace to characterize the debate between legalism and Confucianism as a debate between realism and idealism, or non-ideal theory versus ideal theory. And I myself succumb to that temptation. I do that as well. I often present the legalists as realists. But I still, when I read something like this, today's chapter, the chapter that we read for today that Daniel wrote, and when I read the Han Feizi, I want to say there's some respects in which actually the Confucians are the greater realists, the greater non-ideal theorists. And that has to do with, at least for some purposes, like family life, relationships between neighbors and close friends. I think actually natural affection and sort of natural pro-social attitudes that we develop in the normal process of forming relationships with people, I think those are more reliable, more realistic psychological bases for good social behavior than systems of laws and punishments. I think it's much easier, actually, to get two neighbors to support each other through kind of ritually structured interactions where they show respect to each other and so on, and through natural affection that they develop in the course of, relying on each other over the course of many years. I think it's more difficult by comparison to elicit mutually supportive behaviors from neighbors simply through systems of rewards and punishments. So I guess I'm just saying, despite the fact that I myself sometimes depict the legalists as realists or as non-ideal theorists, I actually think that there's a way in which a reasonably nuanced Confucian like Xunzi could lay claim to that ground as being the more realistic thinker, at least when it comes to these relationships where people have lots of regular interactions and thus form natural bonds with each other.
I think that's a great way of putting it. Or another way of putting it too is that maybe, to be slightly charitable to legalists, it's realistic in the short term, but not if the aim is for long-term success. I mean, not just about fighting wars and establishing government, but even simple things like, as you say, dealing with friends and family. Or I'll just give you an example from Beijing. There was a really harsh anti-drunken, sorry to go back to the alcohol theme, anti-drunken driving campaign. And there was a time like 15 years ago where there were literally police on every block. And if you were caught with your car, your car would be taken away, even if tiny little sip of alcohol, and you'd be thrown in jail for 2 weeks. I mean, that's pure legalism, right?
Yeah.
And it worked. But eventually, people internalized that this was a bad thing to do. And now there's hardly any random checks of alcohol, drunken drivers in Beijing or China as a whole. But the people's norms have changed. I don't think it's pure legalism because people basically knew that it was kind of bad, but they just didn't act on the weakness of the will. But then you needed this kind of legalist, short-term method for success. But then eventually people internalize it and then the legalists could now withdraw. Yeah, I don't know if that helps.
Yeah. Really interesting. Yeah, right. Actually, I'm inclined to agree with you that it did succeed. The harsh anti-drunk driving campaign succeeded, but it succeeded in part for reasons that Han Feizi is going to have a hard time allowing given his worldview, which is that people had a kind of guilty conscience about it anyway. They always knew they were taking a risk. It was dangerous, and they were risking not just their own lives and health, but the lives and health of pedestrians or other drivers. And so they felt guilty about that. Once you pair that with some strict rule enforcement, with heavy punishment, then they're finally motivated. And as you say, it sticks. Actually, there are these, Paul Bloom, who's famous for these studies of morality in very young children. I can't remember whether he himself did the study, whether his lab did the study, or whether he just mentions it. But there's one where it's meant to elicit young children's views about the rightness or wrongness of various classroom rules. And one of the rules that's supposedly wrong in this particular classroom is you're not allowed to eat in class. And another rule is that you're not allowed to hit other kids. And the intervention that the psychologists undertook was to say to the kids, okay, now let's say the teacher says you can eat in class. Is that all right? And the kids say, oh yeah, that's fine. It's up to the teacher, you know. But then the other one is to say to the kids, okay, now let's say the teacher says you can hit other kids. Is that all right? And most kids are like, no, that's weird. A teacher can't just decide that it's okay to hit other kids. So there you see something like a kind of natural impetus to observe a rule that you don't hit other kids, which somehow strengthens it in a way. It's not just a matter of complying with the rules the authority gives you. And so maybe that's what was going on in the drunk driving case, is people always kind of knew it was wrong. Yeah.
I think the way of putting Xunzi as maybe even more of a realist, maybe another way of putting that is he's tapping into parts of human nature and human motivation that, again, Han Feizi doesn't seem to be thinking much about or putting much weight on. So Peter Strawson has this idea of reactive attitudes in this famous paper that we've talked about. And he thinks that there are these emotion-laden interpersonal responses that structure our moral relationships to one another. And they're not like theoretical constructs. They're like constitutive of what it is to be a participant in the moral community. So there are these responses like gratitude, like resentment, indignation, guilt, shame. And these are constituents of what it is to be a human agent at all. And so we can't help but see people and hold them sometimes accountable or to praise them for good things that they've done. And it seems like a lot of that actually seems to be just kind of missing from Han Feizi's view, which is why I thought he had kind of an impoverished view of moral psychology. And if you miss out on those things, then you're not going to get things right, because you got to like make sense of those parts of people that are deep and that are driving people to act in various ways. And so you're going to get stuff like that nice example that Daniel just put out about the drunk driving. Yeah, so I think you're totally right, Justin. I like that point a lot.
I agree with both of you. And one very concrete way of illustrating this point about the realism of the early Confucians, Confucius, Kongzi, Mencius, Mengzi, and Xunzi all lived to ripe old ages, 70, 80 years old, whereas the legalists all came to awful, terrible deaths at a young age, right? If their own philosophy leads to that form of life or death, then perhaps there's something wrong with it.
Yeah, right.
Well, in Han Feizi's case, he was poisoned, right, by Li Se. And so I think he suffered, from a very terrible act.
Xiangyang, perhaps the most influential of the legalists, because he had direct influence on the Qin. He was tortured to death. His limbs were torn apart by horses in all different directions.
It's a form of punishment he was supposedly credited with inventing. Is that right? According to one version of history. Maybe it's just too gory. But yeah, it involves chariots, tying a person to multiple chariots or horses and having them go in different directions. Yeah, your imagination can fill in the rest, I'm sure. So anyway, the point is, Han Feizi, Xiangyang, they all met untimely early deaths. And so that's right. They lived with the consequences in some sense of their own ideologies. Yeah. Well, if you put it that way, gosh, I definitely endorse Confucianism. Well, we've really managed to talk about a lot. In fact, oftentimes it's the case that by the time Richard and I are done, we feel like, oh, we only got to about 20% of what we intended. But today I felt like we got to a good deal of what we intended and so much more. So it was a very rich discussion. And that's due in large part really to Daniel's very stimulating chapter in his book, which we highly recommend to our listeners. And we will put a link to it in the show notes. But once again, for those of you who don't feel like tracking down the show notes, it is called Why Ancient Chinese Political Thought Matters. That's the title. The subtitle is 4 Dialogues on China's Past, Present, and Future. To be published by Princeton University Press. I bet it'll be out by the time this episode goes live. So thanks so much, Daniel. This has been a wonderful conversation, a great opportunity to talk with you and finally bring you on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation. 谢谢哥们儿.
So nice of you. So I guess we'll say reluctantly that was the way for today. 感谢你的收听. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.